The air in the cramped Milwaukee apartment was a solid thing, a putrid soup of decay and chemicals that hit the two police officers like a physical blow. It was July 22, 1991, just after midnight. The hallway was dim, the only light spilling from the open door of apartment 213. Officer Rolf Mueller's hand went instinctively to his hip, his eyes trying to make sense of the scene. The young black man, Tracy Edwards, was trembling violently, pointing a shaking finger back towards the door he'd just fled from. The neighbor's complaint about a naked man screaming in the alley had just evaporated, replaced by something far darker, far colder. It was the smell of a butcher shop left in the sun, undercut with something medicinal, sour. And there he was. Jeffrey Dahmer stood in the middle of the living room, pale, bleary-eyed, his hair disheveled. He was calm, too calm. The light glinted off polished steel in the kitchen, not just knives, a large, black-handled cleaver, a bone saw, and on the top of the refrigerator, a cylindrical object that made Roth's blood run cold, a gallon-sized glass jar, half filled with a murky liquid, containing what appeared to be a human head. "What the hell is that?" Roth's voice was a tight whisper. Dahmer followed his gaze. His response was flat, devoid of any human inflection. "That's my grandmother. I was preserving her, but she was alive and well in California." The lie was so absurd, so transparent, it shattered any last semblance of a normal domestic dispute. The officers moved with a new, grim purpose. The handcuffs clicked around Dahmer's thin wrists. In the bedroom, more jars, more remains. Polaroid photographs spilled from a drawer, images of unspeakable violence and desecration. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a factory of death, a private charnel house hidden behind a cheap door in the Oxford apartments. The file landed on Roy Hazelwood's desk with a quiet, heavy finality. He opened it, and the first photograph stared back at him. The infamous blue barrel. The one Dahmer had casually pointed to and said contained 3 torsos. The clinical description did nothing to soften the horror. Behind him, other agents gathered, their usual banter silenced. Ken Lanning, the unit's expert on occult and sexually violent crimes, leaned over his shoulder. "How many?" Lanning asked, his voice low. "They've confirmed 4, Hazelwood said, not looking up. "He's talking. He's giving them numbers. 8, 10, more." He flipped a page, then another. The narrative emerging was not one of frenzied, hot-blooded murder. It was a blueprint: luring, drugging, strangulation, dismemberment, preservation, necrophilia, cannibalism. Each step was methodical, each act serving a specific, twisted need. "This isn't anger. This isn't revenge," Hazelwood murmured, more to himself than to Lanning. "This is procurement. He's a collector." The unit's task was not to solve the crime, it was solved. Their mission was to construct a psychological autopsy, to answer the why so overwhelming it drowned out the how. They worked in a cave of data. Maps of Milwaukee were pinned to walls, tracing Dahmer's movements from his grandmother's house to the Oxford apartments. Timelines scrawled on whiteboards in dry erase marker attempted to impose order on the chaos of years of murder. Photographs of the victims, young men, mostly of color, smiled from missing persons flyers, their faces a heartbreaking counterpoint to the clinical evidence photos of skulls and bones. The agent spoke in a shorthand of pathology. Organized, sexually motivated, paraphilic necrophilia. The jargon was a shield, a way to handle the unhandleable, but sometimes the shield cracked. An agent would leave the room after examining a particular photo, returning minutes later with a cup of cold coffee he didn't drink, his face pale. The key, they knew, lay in the patterns. The dismemberment wasn't just disposal, it was a means of permanent possession. The cannibalism, Dahmer would later tell interrogators, was an attempt to keep them with him. The bleaching of skulls, the attempt to create a shrine. The masturbatory acts with viscera all pointed to a profound, catastrophic failure to form human connections. This was a man trying to build a person out of parts, to create companionship through absolute control, to achieve epinomacy that could only exist when the other was utterly, permanently still. Hazelwood requested an interview. He needed to hear the voice, to see the man behind the data. The meeting took place not in a dark interrogation room, but in a bright, secure conference facility. Dahmer was led in, shackled, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He was polite, soft-spoken, his eyes distant behind his large glasses. He answered questions with a disturbing, flat candor. There was no bluster, no pride, just a vacant recitation of facts, as if he were describing a tedious hobby. "Why the skulls?" Hazelwood asked, his own tone, neutral, professional. "I wanted to keep them," Dahmer replied, looking at the table. "I felt like if I did that, they'd be with me, you know, permanent, and the drilling." Dahmer shifted in his chair, the chains clinking softly. It wasn't remorse for the lives he'd ended, it was self-pity for the loneliness that had driven him. "I wanted them to stay, but not to leave. I thought if I made a hole, and put in acid, they wouldn't have a will of their own." The profile was no longer an abstract document. It had a face, a quiet voice, and a bottomless, childlike need that had consumed 17 lives. Back in Quantico, the profile was finalized, but it brought no sense of closure. The team had succeeded. They had delineated the classic markers of an organized, sexual predator with necrophiliac and cannibalistic paraphios. They could trace the likely escalation from fantasy to act, the increasing boldness as his confidence grew, the geographical stability of his hunting ground. They had, in essence, captured the monster on paper, but the victory was ashes. They had mapped the labyrinth, but the labyrinth had no center. No satisfying motive of rage or greed, just a howling void of loneliness and a twisted sexuality forged in the isolation of a neglected adolescence. The case would explode into a media firestorm, a circus of public revulsion and institutional failure. The missed opportunities by police, the return of a naked, drugged 14-year-old Laotian boy, Konarak synthesymphone, to Dahmer's apartment just weeks before the capture would haunt the city. But for the profilers, the deepest horror was locked in the quiet of their analysis. They had to live with the details, to turn them over and over, to make them make sense. Ken Lanning would later say that of all the monsters he'd studied, Dahmer was the one who truly made him question the nature of humanity. With others, you could find a reason, however warped. With him, it was the sheer, utilitarian use of human beings. They were objects. That's a different kind of evil. In the end, the FBI profilers did not capture Jeffrey Dahmer. That was done by 2 beat cops and a brave victim in a stinking hallway. What they captured was his shadow. They pinned it down with psychological terminology, with flowcharts and offender characteristics, trying to build a cage of understanding around something that defied it. They provided context for the courtroom, where Dahmer would be sentenced to 15 life terms, and would later be beaten to death by a fellow inmate. Their work would become a textbook case, studied by a new generation of agents. But in the dim glow of a desk lamp late at night, long after the file was closed and archived, the true weight of their work settled. It wasn't about solving the puzzle. It was about the irrevocable knowledge that such puzzles exist. That a human mind could look upon another living, breathing person and see only components: a skull to bleach, a heart to preserve, a body to consume, all in the service of curing an unbearable loneliness. The monster was behind bars, but the echo of his emptiness, the sheer, mechanistic horror of his appetites, lingered in the quiet, paper-filled rooms of Quantico. The profile was perfect, and it taught them that some darkness cannot be illuminated, it can only be outlined, a void given shape by the terrible things it consumes.